Chapter 521. Things have already happened, and that can no longer be changed anymore. Prince Roger's goal has always been the Goldmans, and the de Armas was just a pawn in his game of chess to deal with the Goldmans. Then what about you and Nolan? What about the hatred that you have against him? She laughed disdainfully. Is it just because you've grown addicted to being Roger's lackey? Daniel Tututade stepped forward, walked up to Maisie, and looked at her indignant expression. Ms. Vanderbilt. You're trying to extract so much information out of me. Are you trying to buy yourself some time so that others can come to save you? Maisie did not utter a single word. He scoffed. It's a pity that no one will come to rescue you. All the accessories that you had on were removed from your body when you were unconscious. Who in the world will be able to locate this place without any tracking or positioning technology? Maisie loosened her hands that were tied behind her. She knew that given Daniel's caution and vigilance, he would definitely have asked his men to remove all the items that she was carrying. The only thing that was left on her now was her ring, which didn't manage to attract any suspicion. Daniel leaned over and stared at her with his gloomy eyes. I think it's very likely that Nolan's virus infection will be exposed soon. Seeing the vain look in Maisie's eyes, he stretched out his hand to clamp her chin. Nolan won't be able to live for long, and there are only 2 days left before the election takes place. So, he'll definitely announce it if he wants to stop the election. Maisie turned her face away forcibly. Did you abduct me because you're betting on the fact that you can use me to blackmail him? Life is a gamble, but this gamble has turned out to be a little out of my expectations. After all, I'm betting that he cares. Maisie glanced at him and did not say a thing. I've asked someone to send a message to Nolan. Guess what? He chuckled. Maisie's determined gaze did not waver. He didn't even ask about me. Daniel looked at her with a pitiful gaze. You've been abandoned again, just like 3 years ago. Maisie stopped breathing for a split second and closed her eyes. Her long eyelashes were covering the dark and secretive emotions that emerged from the bottom of her eyes. Daniel leaned closer to her ear and said in a low voice, I might as well disclose another fact to you. The car accident from 3 years ago was my doing. Maisie's pupils constricted in an instant, and her whole body trembled. The accident from 3 years ago, the accident that killed my father, Sherry, and my baby. The culprit turns out to be him, Daniel Kent. Seeing that she was stunned and speechless, Daniel rubbed her pale cheeks with the back of his fingertips. She was like a porcelain doll that had lost her soul at this moment, delicate-looking, but lifeless. I'm the one who ordered Rowena to do it, but I didn't expect you to be lucky enough to survive that. Not only did you not die, but you also became Mr. Henry's daughter. Daniel took in her distress. I only wanted to use your death to force Hernandez into making a move against the Goldmans. However, it's a pity that bitch, Rowena, got off the grid after helping me with that matter. But it's not a bad thing that you didn't die. At least, you're my captive now. Maisie's gloomy eyes regained their focus gradually, and she turned her face away. Don't use the same trick on me again. Mr. Henry won't make things difficult for the Goldmans even if I were to get hurt or die here today. It'll only mess up your master plan. His gaze turned sharp. Maisie smiled again. Otherwise, why would Mr. Henry send me Staslo? There are still 2 days before the election takes place, and you're here, wasting your precious time on us. But what you don't know is that others are already taking action. Daniel stood up straight, but his face still looked indifferent. Daniel. You shouldn't have brought me to your laboratory. The corners of Maisie's lips rose, and she gave off a bright smile. Your laboratory is well hidden, I'll give you that, so this should be where you store the viruses. Am I right? Such a smile was not what Daniel wanted to see at this moment. A weak person should not act so presumptuously in front of him. Chapter 522. Daniel strangled her with his big hand. Huh? Do you really believe that someone will come to save you? Maisie's face was flushed from being strangled as it became difficult for her to breathe, but she still forced a smile. The basement is hidden at such a secluded location. I think you don't only have the sleeper virus kept here, do you? There should be other viruses here too. Will the people here be able to escape if there is a leakage? Daniel still did not respond. Maisie suddenly lifted her foot and kicked him in the crotch. He was in excruciating pain. But his expression did not give off much of how he felt at the moment. His sharp gaze looked as if he was about to eat her alive. She quickly broke free from the rope that was strapping her while the medical staff behind Daniel pulled out their guns immediately but did not dare to pull the trigger. Although they were wearing protective clothing, they were not wearing protective masks. Once the other viruses were triggered, and they were to inhale any of the viruses, then it would be game over for them. After Maisie dashed behind all the vials used for the experiments, she discovered all the blue tubes that were kept in a silver box. Maisie Vanderbilt. You're choosing to die then? Daniel drew his gun and pulled the trigger, but Maisie dodged the bullet. The tank behind her, which was filled with formalin, was shot, and it started to crack. Mr. Kent, don't shoot. The medical staff shouted. But Daniel would not listen anymore as he had lost his head. The continuous gunshots hit the fire hydrant, causing the alarm to go off, and the red sirens in the laboratory were immediately turned on. Some kind of white gas was leaking out of some of the pipes at the same time. Several broken bottles of liquid, which were sitting on the table, were now exposed to the air. She'll get out. All of the medical staff scattered and fled the scene, while the emergency gate descended slowly. Daniel sprinted toward Maisie. But she turned around and swung her leg upward before he could get his hands on her. However, he raised his elbow to block the kick and avoided it swiftly. Maisie fought back, one move after another, and shoved her hands against his shoulders while he was not paying attention to her. He lost balance, fell onto the table, felt something on his palms when he held the table with his hand to regain balance, and instantly felt lost. Maisie snatched his gun while he lost focus and flung him to the ground with a shoulder throw, but he just so happened to lock her arm. The gates were more than halfway from being fully closed, and there was only a 1-meter gap left. Daniel laughed coldly, turned over, held her down with the weight of his whole body, and strangled her vigorously. Then we shall die together. Anyway, I won't die alone as I have you to accompany me while I'm on my way to hell. Maisie shot him in the leg. He let go of his hands while screaming in pain. She then lifted her leg to kick him away from her body, rolled over, quickly adjusted her posture, got up from the floor, and pointed the gun at his head. The thick white smoke slowly suffused around the room and gradually filled it up. The washing red light became the only color in the vast white tog. Maisie was bleeding from her nose. She could feel her breathing and heartbeat speed up as she raised her hand to wipe her nose. Ha ha ha. Daniel laughed hoarsely. There's no way that you're getting out of this place alive now. Cough, 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 cough. He dropped to the ground and coughed violently. The gate was fully closed now, and the siren had also stopped. Maisie staggered to the table, leaned against it, started to cough slightly, and watched as Daniel coughed up blood. She sat down on the ground along the leg of the table and smiled. I won't get infected by the virus. Daniel stopped moving and raised his head to look at her. He could not see just how nonplussed he looked at this very moment. Because Mr. Henry is the Strix that you've been looking for all these years. My mother was injected with the antibodies that he developed, and I inherited a trait that came from the combination of the virus and the antibodies. Chapter 523. Maisie looked at him and said feebly, I'm still thinking about it. Why do you Kents work so hard to get Prince Roger and those nobles to value you as much as possible? It's because your whole family has very low self-esteem by nature, as your ancestors settled down by acquiring another family's property. Your ancestors weren't even the Kents by blood, nor were they the descendants of generations and generations of wealthy merchants. They were only ordinary people who slipped across the borders and into the country. The de Armas are the genuine nobles among the two families, while the Kents aren't. You want to be valued, so you have to develop a drug for the royal family to relieve them from sickness, cancer, or even death. That's the true meaning of your existence, isn't it? Daniel was rendered speechless and coughed out a huge mouthful of blood. She scoffed. Daniel Kent, this is what you deserve. You told me that life's a gamble. That's right. I deliberately asked Sadai to cover me as I ran away, but it was actually a gamble. I was betting on the fact that you only wanted me. She slowly removed the ring. The red light that was blinking on the interior wall of the ring was a miniature tracker. And I've won in this gamble. Several police cars completely surrounded the Kent mansion. On the day the underground laboratory was exposed, the whole perimeter of the mansion was crowded with reporters, furiously reporting the fact that the virus was being used by someone for secret research. The virus epidemic that had broken out back then quickly made headlines on Google Trends and other major media outlets. And the few days that followed the incident, citizens had been gathering outside of Stoslo's parliament building to protest against the government personnel who were related to the incident but concealed the truth about the virus all these years. Even on the day of the election, the scene was intercepted by too many protesters. And the people who originally supported Prince Roger also began to turn against him. Protests that rose from all over Stoslo could be described as quite intense. In the hospital, at the intensive care unit, the lines shown on the electrocardiogram fluctuated stably. And Maisie was lying on the hospital bed with an oxygen mask on as her eyelashes trembled slightly. She gradually regained consciousness, opened her eyes, and the first thing that caught her eyes was the white ceiling above her. Feeling the sweat and warmth in her palms, she turned her head and saw Nolan resting beside the bed while holding her hand. She removed her oxygen mask, sat up slowly, leaned slightly toward him, and reached out to gently stroke his hair. Nolan suddenly grabbed her wrist, woke up out of shock, and raised his head. Z? He got up immediately and took her into his arms. The boulder that had been sitting on top of his heart had finally been removed as he kissed her at the top of her head. Z, you finally woke up. Maisie rested her chin on his shoulder, leaned languidly against his body, and wrapped her arms around his waist. Yeah, how long have I been out? He replied hoarsely. 5 days. Having said that, he let go of her, grabbed her arms, and gave her a serious look. Why did you put yourself at such a huge risk? Do you know that you almost killed yourself? If she had stayed in the gas for seconds longer, or if his men had not arrived in time, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Staring at his ferocious appearance, Maisie grinned, placed her hands against his cheeks, and coaxed him. That's because I have faith in you, Nolan. So don't be angry, aren't I fine now? Nolan's indifferent face looked tense, and he did not feel like talking to her. Nolan. Maisie grabbed his hand. Knowles. Knowles. Hubby. Her lips were sealed by a damp, warm, and soft sensation. Maisie lowered her eyelashes and wrapped her arms around his neck. Probably because she accidentally moved the needle on her inner elbow, she gasped in pain. Nolan frowned, pushed her back down onto the bed, and said with a reluctant tone, "Look at the condition that you're in. You should behave. You're the one who kissed me first." Maisie's brows looked smug. Nolan stared at her, and nobody could tell whether he was delighted or vexed. Maisie remembered something all of a sudden and asked, "Where's Daniel?" Nolan sat back in his chair. He didn't survive the incident. Chapter 524. When Daniel had been brought out of the basement, it was already too late for him. His lungs and heart had already been infected and damaged by the poisonous gas, while his leg injury had caused too much blood loss. Maisie's gaze shifted, but she did not utter a single word. Nolan glanced at her. "I've explained everything to the police for you. You fired the shot in self-defense, and because you didn't plan to kill him, you only shot him in the leg." She smiled. "Then what if I wanted to kill him?" Nolan squinted his eyes and kept quiet. Maisie turned her head and looked out of the window. He's the mastermind who plotted the accident from 3 years ago, and Rowena was the one who put it into action. Although I wanted to shoot him in the head at the time, seeing him getting the retribution that he deserved, I didn't feel compelled to do so all of a sudden. Nolan leaned forward to look at her and turned her face to make her face him. Promise me, no matter what you do in the future, you're not allowed to put your own life at risk. Maisie was stunned for a split second and then smiled. Then what about you? He did not speak. She then asked, Nolan, you blocked the bullet for me 3 years ago, but have you ever thought about what I would do if something like that were to happen to you? Nolan rested his forehead on hers and said in a low voice. Then we aren't allowed to get hurt in the future, okay? Maisie pecked his lips, and when she succeeded in doing so, she pulled up the blanket to cover half of her face, leaving the pair of watery eyes blinking at him. I'm hungry now. And I want to eat something. The corners of his lips rose as he asked helplessly. What do you want to eat? I want to eat some Spanish food with rice. Maisie touched her stomach and felt even more hungry than when she woke up. She wanted to eat rice now. Nolan went back and made a nutritious meal for her, including winter melon pork rib soup, beef stew, poor man's potato, paella, and caramel flan. Maisie sat cross-legged on the bed obediently, waiting for him to feed her. Quincy suddenly appeared outside the door and was surprised when he saw that Maisie had woken up. Ms. Vanderbilt, you've woken up? Maisie was opening her mouth to eat the paella that Nolan was feeding her. It's about time for me to wake up after being asleep for so long. Why are you here? Nolan asked Quincy. Quincy replied, Elder Master Goldman asked me to come to you. You announced that you've been infected with the virus. He is worried about you. Maisie was taken aback. Did he announce it? But this was to impeach Daniel and bring Prince Roger's scheme of interfering in the election to an end. Daniel is already dead. Not to mention that the virus incident hasn't caused global trauma at present. The people only know that the epidemic that broke out 30 years ago was man-made. However, now that Nolan announced to the world that he is the only carrier of the virus, even if the sleeper virus won't be passed on through human-to-human contact, not everyone will dare to be in touch with people who are infected with the virus. Nolan could see what she was worried about and rubbed the top of her hair. I don't care what other people think as long as you don't care about my condition. I care. Maisie lowered her head. Nolan. I care a lot about it. Nolan was flustered, and his lips were tightly pursed. She directly met his solemn gaze. You should know that by now. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have gotten infected, so I wouldn't just stand here and watch as you die. He gave off a smile. Okay. Quincy and Nolan left the ward, and Quincy caught up to him in an instant. Sir, you haven't told Ms. Vanderbilt that you have less than 3 months left. He wasn't wearing any protective gear when he broke into the laboratory to save Ms. Vanderbilt. This has caused the virus in his body to spread even more rapidly, and his condition has advanced into the 3rd stage of the disease. While Ms. Vanderbilt was in a coma in the past few days, he's been staying in the hospital to suppress his symptoms now that it's come to this point. I'm afraid that even Strix can't do anything about his condition anymore. Chapter 525. Nolan stopped moving forward and did not look back. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm only afraid of dying in front of her. He turned his head. Get Wayland to come over to accompany her tomorrow. The next day, Maisie was sitting on the bed, reading the newspaper. Sure enough, after Daniel died and the truth about the virus was exposed, those people really put all the blame onto the Kents. They did not even mention what they had done with the Kents. They had used the Kents to study this technology. So much so that the Kents had fallen and Daniel had died for their scheme in the end. They did not even have to worry about being implicated. Mommy. Maisie turned around upon hearing that voice and looked out the door in surprise. Her eyes turned bloodshot in an instant. Waylon. Waylon dashed to the bed, and Maisie hugged him. Waylon, is this you? Mommy missed you so much. The children were now 8 years old, and they had only been 3 tiny rugrats back then. Although they had only not seen each other for 3 years, it felt like decades to her. Waylon also hugged her. Mommy, we missed you too. We're all waiting for you to come home. Mommy, don't cry. Waylon wiped her tears for her. Seeing that her son was feeling sorry for her, Maisie wiped away her tears and gave off a wide grin. Okay, I am not dreaming. Right? She held his tender cheeks in her palms. He's my Waylon. I didn't expect Waylon to appear by my side over here in Staslow. Waylon shook his head. Mommy, you're certainly not dreaming. Yeah, I'm not dreaming. Maisie got to touch her son in the flesh. So how could she be dreaming? You're growing so quickly. You're at almost the same height as I am when I'm sitting on the bed. I wonder if Colton and Daisy are like you now. He's truly carved out of the same mold as Nolan. Colton and Daisy are definitely not as tall as me. I'm almost at 5 feet now. Waylon's expression looked solemn. I'll be able to protect you, Colton, and Daisy once I grow up. Maisie paused for a short second and then raised her arm to rub his head. Actually, I don't want you to grow up. It's all because of my incapability. I hadn't been able to be by your side when you needed me most. We don't blame you, Mommy. Maisie gave off a slightly distressed smile. Yes, the kids won't blame me, but after all, I wasn't able to accompany them and be with them all this while. At this time, Sadie appeared outside the ward with a bouquet. Ma'am. You aren't hurt, are you? Sadie shook her head, walked to the bedside, and inserted the flowers into the vase. How are you feeling? Maisie smiled. I'm feeling much better now. After saying that, she spoke to Waylon. Waylon. She's Sister Sadie. Waylon nodded politely at Sadie. Sister Sadie. Sadie was astonished. Who is he? Maisie replied with a smile, he's my son. He's you and Mr. Goldman's son? Sadie looked at Waylon's appearance, which indeed resembled that of Nolan. This also explained why Maisie had such a subtle connection with Nolan. Maisie did not deny it and thought of something. Does Mr. Henry know about this? Sadie nodded. Mr. Henry will arrive the day after tomorrow. He's very worried about you. Maisie lowered her eyes. Strix has been treating me very well as if I am his biological daughter. I was the one who insisted on coming to Staslow to intervene in the de Armas affairs. He even reassigned Sadie to me, but I've made him worry. After all. 2 days later. Maisie was re-examined in the hospital and found there was nothing wrong with her body. Thus, she asked Sadie to go through the discharge procedures for her. Chapter 526. Sadie had been the only one staying in the hospital with her during the 2 days. Nolan was nowhere to be found. Maisie looked out the window from the car. It was already autumn, and the trees growing on both sides of the streets had turned golden. The leaves on the ground looked like a golden carpet, adding color to the surrounding buildings. The leaves danced when the cars drove past them. Maisie brought Waylon to the Easton estate, walked into the villa, and saw STNX waiting for her in the living room. Dad. Maisie walked toward him while holding Waylon's hand. Strix looked at Waylon. Who is this child? He's my son. Maisie smiled as she put her hands on Waylon's shoulders. Waylon Vanderbilt. Strix put down his teacup and smiled. You have a son that's already all grown up. Waylon replied, there are 3 of us. I have a brother and a sister. Maisie smiled but said nothing when she saw how surprised Strix looked. She let Sadie bring Waylon around and had a chat with Strix in the living room. After listening to what happened between her and Daniel, he said, I didn't expect that the Kents would fail. Daniel said that his grandfather was the first person to research the virus. Did you know his grandfather? My father did. He picked up his teacup and took a sip, then continued. He was among the first batch of research students in St. Neots Medical University in Norwich. I heard that he was caught researching the virus genetic cells and was asked to leave the university. Maisie was surprised. Why was he asked to leave? He had good intentions when he first studied the virus genetic cells, but the era he was born in didn't allow him to research viruses. He looked at her. You need to know that people of that generation never mastered research on viruses. And there were religious people. They were worried and believed that researchers had ulterior motives. Maisie paused. Daniel's grandfather's era was after the war, and a lot of places had still been unstable as a result of the war. Since the Black Death happened during the war, the people of that time, especially the religious ones, had been afraid of viruses because they thought that it was a gift from the devil. He had started out wanting to research viruses that could cure cancer and sicknesses, but unfortunately, it became a tactic of his trying to get benefits from the aristocrats and the royals. Strix slowly got up and walked to the window with his arms crossed. I researched viruses for over 2 decades to decipher the sleeper virus's qualities. But I could only create a vaccine that can help the initial stages of the disease, which was useless for late stages. Maisie frowned. She had looked up information during her 3 years in Hans Palace. It was called the sleeper virus because the virus was undetectable. The disease was split into the early, middle, and final stages. After the first year of the early stage, which was the viral period after the incubation period, there would usually be continuous fever attacks and then the patients would fully recover, so it was hard to detect anything. After that, the patient would not fall sick. If the patient had cancer, the deterioration would slow down. The middle stage happened around the 3rd year. At this stage, the virus would have spread to the organs, and when the organs started to fail, the patients with cancer would rapidly deteriorate. Chapter 527. The final stage would happen a short time after the 3rd year. The patient would continuously cough out blood, have a lowered immune system, and have continuous fits of fever. They would suddenly die because the organs could no longer handle it. Maisie thought of something and stood up. By the way, if the sleeper virus didn't have an incubation period and the patient started getting fever and coughing out blood soon after the infection, what kind of virus is it? Strix turned around to look at her. That's a mutated sleeper virus that makes people sick at an accelerated rate. The patient would only have 3 to 4 years left to live. 4 years. Maisie turned pale. How could that be? Nolan was already in his 3rd year. What's wrong, Z? Strix looked at her curiously. Maisie snapped back into reality and said, Dad, is there a cure if infected? Strix furrowed his brows as though he was thinking. The current medical research is not advanced enough to find the pathogen. It would be possible after a few years. There's nothing we can do if one is infected. I've run experiments during your mother's final stage, but it didn't work. A mutated version would be even harder to deal with. The antibodies you kept won't work either? Maisie pretty much broke down when she found out that Nolan had less than 1 year left in him. She should have noticed sooner, but Erwin had only told her that he was gravely sick, but not from what. Nolan hadn't told her how long he had left either. He knew all along. Since he had forced her to get a divorce and leave him to hide his infection, he would already have known he would not be able to live for much longer. He had spent 3 years in sickness, and even when she learned about it, he never showed her how much pain he was in. Z, are you asking for Mr. Goldman? Strix could tell. Maisie paused, then nodded. Erwin told me about you and him. It's tough that he was infected with the mutated virus. Is there no solution? It takes time, he answered. Maisie asked anxiously, how long? He said in a deep voice, don't put too much hope in it. There's only a very low chance. But I'll try my best. Maisie held her hand tight. A very low chance was better than no chances. At the East Island villa. Nolan heard that Maisie was discharged from the hospital from Quincy, slowly put down the documents he was holding, and said, "She's with Waylon?" "Yes. Young Master Waylon and Miss Vanderbilt are at the Easton estate," Quincy answered. "Good. She would probably be happy with Waylon by her side." He thought of something and asked in a low voice, "Did you find out anything about Rowena's whereabouts?" Quincy shook his head. "No. Rowena worked with Daniel Kent 3 years ago, but I have no idea why she disappeared." Nolan looked cold. Rowena had caused the accident 3 years ago, but Daniel was the mastermind behind it. He had probably tried to make the de Armas go against the Goldmans because of the incident. But he had miscalculated because Hernandez already knew their motive. Rowena had been hiding for 3 years and must have changed her looks or identity. Otherwise, it would be impossible to hide her traces. Chapter 528. A guard appeared outside. "Mr. Goldman, Quincy, Miss Vanderbilt is here." Nolan paused and answered calmly, "Send her in." Nolan wanted Waylon to spend time with Maisie and not see her for a few days, but she still came over. Maisie walked in looking solemn but calm as if nothing out of the ordinary. Quincy left and closed the door after him. Maisie walked to the study desk. "Are you avoiding me?" Nolan casually smiled. "Am I?" She moved the documents in front of him to the side. "Yes. You didn't come to see me when I was discharged. Are you regretting it?" He smiled but didn't answer. Maisie put both her hands on the desk. "Nolan, if you're going to regret it, I won't show up any longer from tomorrow onward." Nolan stared at her with a secretive look. Maisie sat on the desk and leaned toward him. Her soft hair fell to the front, looking more seductive. She put a finger on his pocket square. "If you don't say anything, I'm going to take it as a yes." "So this would be my last." "Last what?" His voice escaped his throat while he held her wrist. The documents on the desk were scattered over the floor, and she was pulled into his arms before she could react. Maisie looked at him with her beautiful eyes. "You know what?" His chest burned while he held her right. "Why are you here, Z?" Maisie lay on his chest. "Because I missed you." Nolan lowered his head to kiss her, and they embraced. They were so close his breathing was messing up hers. He focused on kissing her but still asked, "Why would it be the last?" When Maisie could breathe again, she opened her eyes. "Because I'm leaving." Nolan put his palm behind her back but lost his desire to kiss her. That statement distinguished whatever thoughts he had. Maisie put her arms around his neck and got close. Her pretty eyes seductive. "Are you feeling sad?" He grunted. Maisie smiled. "You want to push me away but don't want me to leave." "Nolan, make up your mind." Nolan nibbled her lip then ran his soft fingers across her lips. "What can I do then?" He sounded serious and helpless. He couldn't let go because he never wanted to feel how he did 3 years ago anymore, but he was afraid that one day he would pass away in front of her, and she would be sad. Maisie held his hand and put it to her face. "You should hold me close." "You're here already." "Then what are you still worried about?" Maisie laughed. "I'm going to Morwich for a few days." "Are you not going to let me go?" She was going back to Morwich? Nolan frowned, and she raised her hand to loosen his eyebrows. "Nolan. You'll wait for me, right?" He smiled and kissed the back of her hand, then answered, "Yes." Everything felt surreal outside at night, and even the neon lights in the distance were dim. In the night of indulgence, heartbeats and the warmth of skin carried a lethal poison that burned. Nolan kissed her to stimulate her. "I don't want you to leave anymore, Z." Nolan lay there, moving her messy soft hair behind her ear. His eyes were filled with turbulence. She struggled to ask, "Why?" He smiled. "I don't want any other man enjoying your seductive look." Chapter 529. Maisie huffed and stayed unmoving in his arms. I'm tired. Nolan turned around. Tired? Maisie lazily hugged his neck. I'm all yours now. You little minx. Nolan kissed her deeply. It was another night, filled with love. The next day, Maisie woke up and made breakfast when she heard movement outside. She looked up and saw Titus coming over with 2 bodyguards. Titus was shocked when he saw Maisie and frowned. Why are you here? Waylon followed Quincy down the stairs. Quincy's expression slightly changed and walked forward carefully. You're here, sir. Have you forgotten what I told you, or are you ignoring it? Titus meant letting Maisie get close to Nolan. Waylon coldly spoke before Quincy could answer. Why can't Mommy see Daddy? You're all defying me. Titus growled. Even his great-grandson was talking back. Maisie calmly removed the apron and smiled. You can stop me from meeting Nolan. But can you stop his feelings? What do you mean by that? You witnessed it for yourself. You failed to stop my relationship with Nolan until now. Ignoring Titus' pale face or the shocked expressions of the others around, Maisie calmly said. I know you blame me because I was the reason Nolan was infected, but did you know who pulled the trigger? It was your most trusted Rowena. Titus was shocked. What did you say? Daniel told me everything. He was the reason Nolan was infected with the virus. But the person who took the shot was Rowena. Maisie smiled without joy. It's true, Nolan wouldn't have been infected if he didn't take the bullet for me, but how could you blame me? Was I the one who caused Nolan to become how he is now? You let Rowena go on multiple occasions and let her take advantage. Do you think Daniel would have had a chance to use me against Nolan if Rowena didn't work with him in secret? Each word made Titus look more aghast and paler. Quincy and the others gasped. What Maisie said was true. Titus had no right to blame her. If he had been cruel to Rowena, she wouldn't have had the chance to escape to Staslo. Nolan had pretended not to know Maisie in Staslo and hadn't exposed her identity. Rowena had been the only person who knew and had been colluding with Daniel since a long time ago. She had disclosed Maisie's identity to Daniel, and they had found a chance. Titus threw his hands up and left. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe because the truth was too much for him to handle. Rowena was a Summers. Titus had kept letting her go out of respect for her family because he valued relationships. He had been treating her as his granddaughter since she grew up around him. He had brought her up. No one could be cruel to the child they had brought up when put on the spot. No one could have predicted the future. Titus could never have imagined all these things would happen to his grandson when he let Rowena go. Chapter 530. Titus was probably regretting it. Mr. Goldman? Quincy saw Nolan standing at the stairs and was surprised. Had he heard everything? Nolan slowly walked down the stairs and stopped in front of Maisie, giving her a half-smile. I thought you had left. Maisie placed the cutlery on the table. I still have to make breakfast for my son and my son's father before I leave. Nolan smiled warmly when he heard my son's father. It looks like you've made my grandfather lose sleep and appetite for the next few days. Maisie poured a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice for Waylon. I was just being honest, was I wrong? Nolan grinned, hugged her while ignoring everyone around, and sniffed her hair. That's great. Maisie saw that everyone was there and pushed him away with her elbow while blushing. Stop it and have your breakfast. I need to go back later. Mommy, are you leaving again? Waylon, who was having breakfast, looked a little sad when he heard go back. Maisie's heart shuddered, but she patted his head. I'm going back to Morwich for a few days. You'll have to take care of your father for me for the next few days. Waylon nodded, thinking that his mother was just leaving for a few days and not for a long time. Nolan smiled, but mostly because he was helpless. Are you that worried about me? She slowly peeled the shell of the egg off and casually answered, "Yes, I don't want to come back and not see you." Nolan was surprised and saw that she was worried, so he calmly smiled and said, "That's not going to happen." 2 days later, in Morwich, at St. Page, a black sedan slowly drove into St. Neil's Medical University. The maple trees along the way were burning like fire. The people strolled to enjoy the view and were having a great time. Morwich's temperature was very different between day and night compared to Zlokova and Staslo. Even when it was already autumn, one could wear short sleeves during the day, but they would need to bundle up at night. Morwich's winters were chilly and long. So stalactites could be seen hanging along the edges of the roof when it snowed. "Have you made up your mind, Z?" Strix turned to look at her. "The experiment will require a lot of your blood and might not work the first time. Thus, we would need to continue. Repeatedly taking and injecting blood will be tough on the body." Maisie smiled. "I'll be fine. If it works, there will be a way to control viruses like the sleeper virus in the future. It wasn't just to save Nolan, but for other people as well." "Do you trust me that much?" Strix let out a long sigh. "Even I don't trust myself." She paused. "Because you couldn't save my mother?" Strix clenched his jaw. He didn't deny it. "She used to trust me a lot too, but by the time the antibodies had been found, she was already in the late stage, which was equivalent to the late stages of cancer. It was useless. How could he think of saving others when he couldn't even save the woman he loved? That was why Strix had left the medical field and stopped using the name Strix. He had even gotten someone to remove all his information from the medical field. In Zlokova we have a saying, "There can be miracles when you believe." Maisie smiled at him. "Failure is just a step closer towards success. I think Mom took away the antibodies to prove that you didn't fail."